Hey there, everybody. My name's Scott. I'm with Artists Network, and I want to welcome you to this drawing time. And what I've done here is I've set up a small still life here that I'm going to be working on today, and I'm hoping you'll join along with me. This is a perfect opportunity for us all to take some time out of our day to sharpen our skills, to put our attention onto something that we can. That allows us to kind of step away from what's happening in the world today. So thank you for joining me. I'm hoping that you will kind of take some time to follow along. If you've got your charcoals ready, if you've got some paper, and if you've got some simple objects we can draw along together. If not, feel free to just watch. I'm going to talk through my process and we'll get this drawing done. So as you can see, this is my subject here. I've got my coffee cup, and I've chosen this for two main reasons. One is that it's going to give me an opportunity to explore value relationships. This is something that I need to be working on in my own work. So as a painter, I find that I often need to kind of step aside from painting and just draw for a bit. And one of the things, again, that I'm working on is how to control values. And doing a white-on-white subject is a really great way to do that. Now, and then the other benefit to working on this is that it kind of sets me up for the next drawing that I'm going to do, which is going to be online. So if you follow along with me, we're going to be doing this again on Wednesday, and the focus on that drawing is going to be online. This setup here, by focusing on value, my goal is actually to try to get rid of the line in the drawing. And I'll explain what that means as we go along. For some of you, if you've never drawn before, if you really haven't spent much time kind of working with charcoal, the way we handle edges is really kind of critical, and we can handle that in multiple ways. In this drawing, it's all going to be about value relationships rather than using lines to define an edge. So I'm just going to dig right into it, and as I'm drawing, I'm going to kind of talk through my process. I've got some vine charcoal here that I'll be working on. I've got actually two kind of dimensions of the vine charcoal, so a thicker and a thinner one. I've got charcoal pencil, and that I'm going to be using for kind of some of the finer details. I've actually got this chalk pencil, which I don't use a whole lot, but I think it's going to come in handy in terms of refining some of the lighter kind of highlights, some of these thin edges. You can see on the lower left of the screen, I've got the reference image here. I took this photo at exactly the same angle that I'm looking at my still life here. So I can be looking at my still life and working directly from life. And then you'll get a sense for what I'm actually seeing from that reference photo. And then it just simply, I've got an eraser, I've got a rubber eraser, I've got a kneaded eraser, which comes in really handy, and I've got some of these shading stumps that I'll bring in later as well. So to get started, the first thing I want to do is actually to get rid of all the white. So again, the purpose of this still life here, why I chose this object specifically, is it gives me an opportunity to really study a white-on-white value relationship. So what this is allowing me to confront is the idea that even though my brain knows that I'm looking at a white object, I'm looking at a white cup on a white table, the true value that I'm looking at, and value is the term that we use to define the relative lightness or darkness of a subject. So my brain is looking at these white objects, and it's going to naturally want me to use white. I want to do it, and I can't really do that if I just do a white-on-white drawing here. You're not going to see anything. What I'm actually seeing, what the optical truth is of what I'm looking at, is there's a very wide range of values. Even in some areas, I have a really dark. And most of the subject that I'm looking at, if you look at that cup, the whitest whites are actually in the highlight areas. And so for the most part, what I want to do is get rid of all of that white. Our brain tends to calibrate things. Our eyes tend to calibrate to the value relationships around us. And if I have the white page in front of me, it's going to be calibrating everything in relationship to that. So I want to get rid of that first. So I'm taking my vine charcoal, I'm kind of just building up layers here. And you can see that I've got these kind of funky little marks that's transferring some of the texture of the drawing board underneath. I'm not going to worry too much about that. I'm not going to be able to erase back down to the white of the paper. That's just not going to happen here. So right away I know in my mind that there's no getting back to the white of the paper. So everything is going to be now adjusted to the gray values that I'm establishing here. Just building up layers of charcoal. Now, one of the other things that this does, and you'll see later on in the drawing, is that I refer to it as seasoning. It kind of seasons the paper. It gets it ready to accept other layers of charcoal on top of it. That first layer of charcoal we put down is going to grab quite strong onto the paper. And as you can see now, it's actually some of that texture is starting to disappear. I'm starting to get some of the these kind of darker spots are kind of blending in with some of the lighter gray. So again, just getting rid of all of that white. Going to build up even more value here. And then by doing this, it's also going to allow me to work on what's called negative drawing or subtractive drawing, where instead of adding on and drawing onto the surface, I'll actually be subtracting with the eraser. But for now, I need to kind of orient myself to the page here, and I want to start indicating some basic marks for the cup. And knowing that none of this is going to be final. And you can see that I'm kind of taking kind of multiple stabs at that curve, the opening. This is the opening to that cup. I'm going to be drawing the base here. And my main goal at this stage is to look at the basic proportions. So what I've laid out here is the opening, the distance from the back edge to the front edge down to the base of the mug here, the cup. And I'm comparing that to what I'm looking at here, and getting myself in the rough position where it's it's close, but I know that throughout the drawing I'm going to be continually correcting, and I really don't want to be locking myself into anything at this point. So I'm just kind of giving myself some rough marks, looking at the basic angles here at the edge of the cup. And I'm not going to forget about the shadow here. We've got a cast shadow. And in this case, one of the things I love about the vine charcoal is here. Now, if I draw it at this scale, you can see how that shadow is running off the edge. I don't know if I like that. If I don't like it, I can simply do this, and I've wiped it out. I like to think of this kind of similarly to drawing in sand, where you're making your marks. You can wipe them out and do it again over and over again, and that's really what the drawing process is all about. It's about allowing the image to kind of emerge on the paper, and you're constantly adjusting. I feel like that's too high, so I can wipe that down. Maybe I'll work a little bit smaller. And so another skill that this is helping me to develop and kind of refine is kind of composition. And then you can see one of the things that I like to think about as I'm working out these curves is not doing it in one steady mark. It's breaking it up into shorter segments here, sometimes even straight segments within that curve. Looking at the angles, so this is kind of some comparative measuring. So what I'm doing, one of the really helpful tools as an artist that if you're new to drawing and you want to try to develop, you want to improve your skills, get really good at looking in two places at once. So if I'm studying this cup, I'm also keeping some awareness on what this hand is doing, what my drawing is actually doing. So as I'm putting my attention on the angle of the handle, for example, I'm also paying attention to the direction in the periphery, in the peripheral area of my vision, what that is doing. Is that matching the angle that I'm seeing there in front of me? And I want to kind of straighten this up. I feel like it's kind of getting a little wonky here. Going to kind of work on the base here. Going to work on kind of laying out the shadow. And I've got what I love about this setup here is I actually have multiple shadows. I've got this primary kind of dark shadow here from an overhead light, but I've also got some other kind of shadows here that are overlapping, and that's exciting to me. It's going to give me some an opportunity to kind of explore additional value relationships and some subtlety. So again, I'm just kind of mocking that up right now. This, you can see that feels really slanted, so I want to start to straighten that out. So I'm going to use a kind of a horizontal axis to help kind of guide that. And I'm just trying to get my mind in order right now. These initial stages in the drawing process are about just kind of orientation, figuring out where the object goes, what are the basic value relationships that I need to explore, and also identifying where the trouble spots are going to be. So this is going to be a trouble spot for me, understanding the opening here of the cup, getting that oval correct. So you can see I've taken probably 20 passes already at least to establish that opening. It still feels a little bit crooked. There is a bit of a slant from what I'm seeing. If I were to divide the opening of the cup perfectly down the center, it's not perfectly horizontal. There's a bit of an angle from my perspective, so I'm going to incorporate that in there, and I'm feeling like that's pretty good. And then maybe what I need to do is actually I need to adjust this here so that the cup becomes more kind of perpendicular. This right here, and you can see I'm holding up my charcoal, closing one eye. I'm lining up the charcoal with the edge of the cup, and doing some kind of angle sighting to compare the angles. So I'm taking that angle and I'm carrying it over to my drawing and comparing that to what I've got in front of me. All right, so I've kind of worked through some of the initial thinking in this drawing. Now what I want to do is incorporate some of that negative drawing, so I can start to erase out some of that background here. Now I don't have a fine line around the edge of the cup, which is good. I don't want anything permanent at this stage. I'm kind of sneaking my way up into the drawing. I'm going to continue to adjust the angles here as we go. And I'm going to start to erase out some of the highlights. Or not even highlights, just some of the lighter values here. Now, you can see this is about as light as I'm going to be able to get. If you think back to that original white of the paper, that's really, it's gone now. I really cannot get white back into this. Part of that is just the nature of the paper, the charcoal itself, and I'm not worried about that at all. What that means is that if this becomes my new white, then everything else drops down in value similarly. I kind of think of them like, musical kind of keys, or if you're thinking about a piano, how you can go from one octave down to the next. The relationship between the notes stays the same. You're just shifting octaves. So what I need to do is I need to shift the octave down a little bit in this drawing and reduce the values a bit. So I'm going to kind of erased out my shadow there. All right, so I'm feeling a bit better about that. Now we need to reestablish a shadow. Now I don't know if you can see this, but my hand's already picking up a lot of charcoal. I'm trying to be careful not to use my fingertips. Those are more oily than the other parts of my hand. And so if I do any smudging or kind of blending, I try to use the side of my hand here, sometimes the palm, or if I need to use my finger, I'll try to use the side rather than the fingertips, because what can happen is that the oils in the fingers can impact the paper and it can sometimes either hold or resist the charcoal in ways that are less than desirable. So I'm going to block in the shadow. I'm going to think about that shadow. That shadow actually extends underneath the cup here. So as I'm drawing in that shape, I'm gonna kind of imagine what that's doing there, how it's passing through underneath the cup. Okay, I'm just kind of working at blocking in that shadow. None of these values are going to be correct as well, so that what you kind of learn in the drawing process. And if you've never really spent a whole lot of time drawing, I'd encourage you to give it a shot. And one of the things that I found in working with students over the years is there's a tendency to want to make those marks permanent right out the gate. We want to get to that level of finish. And one of the things that drawing has taught me is that you never get it right the first time. You have to continually adjust and correct as you go. And then with that in mind, if you've already set that as an expectation that you're going to be adjusting the marks later, it kind of frees you up to make the necessary mistakes to advance you in the drawing. You know, of course, the more you practice, the more likely you are to hit those values kind of right out of the gate. You'll get to the finish more quickly. But even then, you start to embrace those initial kind of missteps, you know, with kind of enthusiasm. You know that it's going to happen, and so your goal is to accept them, move into it, and get to that next level of finish. So here's what I'm doing right in here. As I'm working on the handle, now I'm starting to think about that negative space. So the way I've drawn it here, this feels far too large, and so I can use that negative shape, the shape inside the handle, to help correct the form of that handle. And as I'm working on that handle, I'm thinking about the overall structure of it. It's a band that wraps around in space. So there's kind of a horizontal dimension to it that kind of wraps through. And so what I want to do is I want to track the path of each of these planes. So here's the end plane. There's the top surface along here. If I follow that end plane and wrap around, I can carry that back into the body of the cup here. If I take that top edge, I can see that it disappears along in here, and it starts to flatten out, and then we pick up the bottom section of that cup right in here. And again, at this stage, it's not about necessarily refining the actual image as much as getting my head around the form and understanding it. The better I understand the form, the more precise my drawing will be towards the end. And so this working with vine charcoal kind of gets me to that point more quickly. I can adjust quite a bit more easily as I go. One of the things I want to study too is how this handle extends behind the curve of the body of the cup here. Almost use my hand. You can see how much that vine charcoal really picks up. I'm feeling pretty good about the overall structure that I've got. It's pretty sloppy at this point, but my understanding of the cup is pretty much there, and now I can start to kind of refine. One of the things you'll also see kind of in my technique and my process here is I'm holding the sticks, and you'll see it with the pencil as well, farther back, and that allows me to control the pressure a little bit better. As I hold it up to the tip here, I'm going to have more of a tendency for it to become a kind of heavier mark, and I don't want that at this point. I want to keep things light and loose, and when I'm ready for control, that's when I'll kind of shift in towards the end of the pencil here, or the charcoal. Okay, so let's see. Yeah, so I feel like I can kind of move to this. This is a compressed charcoal stick. You can see it's a 2B, pretty soft, and so these pencils come in a range of hardnesses and softnesses. I grab this 2B. It's like, again, it's fairly soft. This allows me to create kind of darker values when I need it. And it also is hard enough to get some detail as well. So this edge here is still bothering me, right along in here. So I'm going to kind of adjust that as I go. You see that took that right out. I'm not worried about that because in my mind I already know I can get back to where I was in this cup. I don't need to be precious with the marks that I've already laid because I know I'm going to be coming back around into them a bit. So, all right. I think what I want to do is start building up the values inside the cup. And I'm going to be doing some cross hatching. So you can see all of these marks are moving in one direction. And I'm keeping the edge of the charcoal kind of engaged with the paper. I'm not using the point. If I use the point, it will actually create a more permanent mark that I don't want to deal with right now. It actually kind of embeds it into the paper. It kind of embosses the paper. So most drawing is going to be done with the side of the charcoal engaged. And when I'm ready for a more permanent mark, then I can switch my grip and create a more permanent mark. You know, I can really move that point down into the paper here. Let's see. One of the things that I'm also thinking about as I'm working on the interior of the cup is I'm using my marks to reinforce the cross contour of the object. Now, if you're unfamiliar with that term, the contour lines represent the kind of the outer edges of an object. There's an outline. If I were to make one line that moves around the object, that would be an outline. A contour line would be the lines that move around the edges, and then the cross contour lines are the lines drawn inside those shapes. So inside this main shape in the cup, these marks here are representing the cross contour, and I can use that to reinforce the dimensionality of that cup. So this edge here goes downward. It's a vertical wall that curves away and kind of scoops under, and so I want my marks to reflect that as well. And so I can have vertical marks that represent the vertical nature, the vertical dimension of that back wall of the cup. And then I can also have marks that kind of curve around the form here to reinforce that curve that scoops away from us here. And so if I can kind of start to define the edge of the cup here. And you can see that I'm not taking it in one pass, kind of sneaking up on it, working bit by bit, because I have the major kind of perspective already established. I kind of work that out a bit. Let's see. Start to refine that edge a little bit. Some of these edges you can see it get lost right in here. It's really difficult to see where that turn of the cup ends and where that background begins, and that's great. I want my drawing to reflect that as well. And let those edges just disappear when needed. I can use some negative drawing here, some erasing back out to define that edge. And smooth things out a little bit. And then erase back out. I'm switching sides here. I'm not staying focused in any one spot too long. I want to keep moving around. What happens, you'll notice, and especially if you're drawing along with me, is if you stay in one spot too long, we start to kind of distort. It starts to distort our understanding of that, and so you always want to be bouncing back and forth between thinking about the specific shape in front of you, what you're observing, and its context. Where is it in the context of the object? So as I'm drawing the handle again, you can see I had to drop that down. I drew it too high, and that changed the position of it on the cup. And again, I want to kind of watch. I want to be mindful of the this negative space, the shape inside the handle. That's actually more valuable to me. It's more of a helpful tool to look at this shape here, the inside hole, that shape versus the shape of the handle. In part of that, and this kind of ties into what I was saying earlier about value, in that we understand, our brain is telling us that that's a white object, so it just seems weird to be drawing values on it and making all of these grays. But optically, that's what we're looking at. We're looking at all of these grays. And the same can be happening with the object itself. I have an internal understanding of that handle. I think I know what that means and what it looks like. And so if I draw from that, I'm most likely actually going to be incorrect. The idea that this is a handle is influencing how I'm drawing that. And so drawing the negative space, the space around it, it becomes a helpful tool because I don't have any identity for this. This isn't a thing that I'm drawing. It's the space around the thing. And as a result, I can actually see that more objectively. I can understand the optical truth of that more clearly. And that's really the power of negative space and understanding the shape around the objects, is it distances you from your kind of preconceived notions of the object you might be drawing. And again, this is still going to continue to adjust. Here's where I feel like I'm incorrect. There we go. That's going to fix it a bit better. Is bringing that point down. I was kind of drawing it too pointedly. I still feel like I can open that up, wrapping my head around that form a bit. Going to let that sit there because I'm getting too fixated on it. I need to step away, focus on something else, and then get back to it. Now these shading stumps become really handy. If you don't like using your fingers, or your hands, or even a paper towel to draw with, use these shading stumps. But think again about the directionality of your marks. Whenever I'm making these marks, I always want to be aware of the plane, the direction of the marks that I'm making. And in this case, one of the things I want to be careful about is I don't want to get too precious with this edge. If I need to, I can take these marks right over the edge of the cup, and I can always bring that back, right? So, and that's actually going to create perhaps a better edge than if I'm really kind of working up, tightly up against that edge. So whenever I have those overlapping forms in a drawing, I try to actually just physically overlap them. I'm bringing this back wall down behind the edge of the front edge of the cup, and I'm going to bring that front edge back in on top and kind of cut that back out. And because what can happen is if you're too precious with an edge, it can start to leave a halo around there. You don't quite meet that edge, and it can become problematic later on in the drawing. So when you can, directly overlap your marks. If we know that that's behind, this is on top, place that background down first, use your eraser to cut back in on top, and give yourself that nice sharp edge here. So you can see in here, I don't have any real contrast in my values here. Now, if some of these marks get too strong, I can switch to this kind of circular mark here. And then what I want to do is actually I'm going to use my kneaded eraser to kind of tap out some of this. So one of the things I really love about the kneaded eraser is that if I'm being kind of sensitive to it, it can actually become an effective smudging tool as well. You can see it kind of picks up a lot of that, picks up a layer of charcoal, and then that can help to actually kind of smooth things out a bit. It blends a little bit more effectively. And then if it builds up too much charcoal, you simply knead it like bread, and it's like magic. It just disappears here. So you get back to a clean eraser. All right, so I've got a bit of contrast here that I'm feeling good about. And now I'm going to kind of leave that for now. I'm going to focus now on the interior side. So what you'll see is that I kind of started the process a bit with vine charcoal, and then I switched to the compressed charcoal. The compressed charcoal is just heavier, it's more permanent. You can still erase it, but it's going to provide a more permanent layer. That vine charcoal, as you saw earlier, this whole part of the drawing is now gone. It's on the bottom of my hand right now. This layer of the compressed charcoal is going to be more permanent. And so I'm kind of working my way down from top to bottom. And now here, what you may have noticed in the reference photo is that there's a lot of subtlety happening in here. You can actually see in this area here, there's some reflected light. There's some light bouncing off the surface and catching the bottom edge of that cup. I want to be really careful at this stage not to overstate that reflected light. That can be a challenge as well. As once you become aware of it, if you haven't really practiced drawing a whole lot, and something like reflected light is something that's new to you, once you see it, we have a tendency to overstate it and draw it too heavily. And so what I try to force myself to do to overcome that is just ignore that for now. What I'm looking at now is what's called the shadow shape. There's one giant shape here. Actually, the value here in the cup is far more closely aligned with the value here in the shadow than it is to the value in the light area or even back in this area. So what I want to do is think about the overall shadow shape. I want to think about this as one shape here. Let those merge together, and I'm going to kind of sneak up on the values a little bit, especially in that bounce light and the reflected light there. So in this case, there's kind of the shadow core, the deepest part of the shadow in the cup is right in here. It's not against the edge, it's right up against, kind of right here in the middle. So I can start to build up those values. And what I did is I just became aware that I wasn't following my previous advice of following the cross contour of the cup. And so I want to just be mindful of that and kind of come back around to it. I want to give myself some indicators here of the various cast shadows. Keeping my marks really light and loose. And again, I'm just dragging the tip across rather than drawing and almost like I'm writing, holding the tripod grip here. I'm just letting it kind of scrape across the surface. That makes a less permanent mark. And the thing that I'm looking at too is I've got three main divisions here in the cup. I've got the distance from the back edge to the front edge, the distance from the front edge down to the base of the cup, and the distance from the base of the cup to the bottom edge of that shadow. And what I want to pay attention to are those relationships. And so if I look now, I feel like this is pretty consistent. I've got these two at about the same distance. And that's incorrect from what I'm looking at. In reality, this distance here, and I need to bring up the shadow here so that this becomes much shorter. It's about just over half, maybe 2/3 of that distance from the base to the top of the cup. About 2/3 of that distance is the height of that shadow. And that technique here in shading, for anybody who's new to drawing, may not have heard this before, that term is comparative measuring. So again, I'm just comparing the dimensions of what I'm looking at in front of me with what I have on the drawing, on the paper here. I'm going to make some of those adjustments as I go. One of the things that now I want to think about in the shadow area as you're filling in these areas is just as though what I was saying earlier about using the cross contour of the object to help reinforce the dimension of it. The shadow is on a flat surface. It's on a flat plane. And so I'm going to be running my marks here in the shadow areas to coincide with the perspective of that plane. I don't want to be using vertical marks here. I want to be using marks that reference the horizontal nature of that plane. If and anything, I could kind of work in some perspective, imagining a vanishing point that these lines might be following along. But in general, I think in this case, I'm going to be running these marks horizontally so that when we perceive these marks, we're differentiating them between the marks in the cup. So even though they're similar in value, the cast shadow and the shadow of the cup, the horizontal marks on the shadow contrast the vertical marks in the cup, and we'll understand them as two separate planes there, if that makes sense. All right, so I'm building up those values there. I want to darken in these values. And this is where, if you get the directionality of your marks worked out, it becomes a bit more forgiving in terms of blending. If you're the type of artist that really likes smoothly blended areas, and you don't like those marks, then it becomes less of an issue for you looking at the direction of those marks. But if like me, I don't like to fuss too much in a shadow area. And I don't want to make things a perfectly smooth area. And so though I know those marks, my shading marks are going to show up, so I want them to be in service of the structure of the object. I want them to serve a purpose there. And I don't want them to work against what I'm trying to portray here. So I'm feeling like that's pretty good. I'm going to start doing some kind of smudging and some blending. Kind of knock down some of these values here. Kind of gets a little bit darker along this edge here. The lightest part on the outside is right here, and then right along the edge of the lip of the cup. Just going to keep drawing a bit. And you can see this has really just disappeared. The transition between the cup and the cast shadow has essentially disappeared, which is intentional at this point. Because when I'm shading, again, I want to be thinking of that overall shadow shape, not the shape of the cup down in that area. Because I don't want there to be too strong of a differentiation there between those values. In this case, the shape of that shadow is more important to me than the shape of the cup. Because just the top edge of that cup is doing a lot to convey what that object is. Now I'm seeing some issues with the curve here of the cup. I might bring that in, and in this case what I can do is kind of sneak up on that curve and kind of bring it kind of cutting back into that shape until I'm happy with it. Now in this case, one of the things that's really actually helpful in this case is that I can actually see the video in front of me, and that provides me another angle at which to view the drawing. And I can make some of those corrections there. I can sneak up in here, bring this up. And if you don't have that available to you, then what I recommend doing is stepping back. And I don't want to be doing that as part of this demonstration. Can't really step away. I'm kind of locked in right now. But you want to be looking at it from a variety of angles and positions, and I refer to that as changing the context of the drawing. We understand the drawing I understand it from this point of view, where I'm sitting right now, and I'm interpreting the form and the perspective of this object from this point of view. By stepping away, by flipping it upside down, by looking at it in a mirror, you're changing the context of that a bit. You're changing your relationship with the drawing in a way that allows you to see it more clearly. And the more you can do that, the more effective your drawing is going to be. You're going to be able to correct things more effectively. I want to kind of straighten out these marks here. I don't really like the angles that I place here using now horizontal and circular marks. I'm going to get rid of some of those, kind of those angled marks here. And I'm going to kind of adjust them a little bit. And then I want to be thinking too about this shadow in here, bringing those together. And I think what I can do is actually start to kind of do some negative drawing within that shadow. Lighten this part of the shadow up a bit. I don't have to be too cautious with the edge here. So now I'm lightening the value. I can always reestablish the shape of that shadow using my kneaded eraser again. One of the things that I'm observing right here is that I've got this cast shadow here, and where it aligns with the cup, with the base of the cup, I'm kind of being too precious with that a bit. I need to, actually, it needs to cut in behind the handle, kind of tucks in under there. So I'm going to lay that down right now. I'm going to bring the handle back in on top of it. And in this case, the handle is darker than that shadow. Do some more negative drawing. Squinting at your eyes is a really helpful tool. When you're observing value relationships, our eyes will optically, it'll prioritize value relationships when you squint. When you focus on something, it actually prioritizes detail and color relationships. And so if you're looking to understand the value of something, you're actually going to be best served by squinting your eyes and letting them lose focus, letting them blur out a little bit. I'm going to, let's see, I'm going to erase this down, smudge this a little bit. And kind of reestablish the value here. So it's a little bit darker here at the front. All right. Now I don't really care for this shape along here. I'm going to adjust that a little bit. So I'm using my charcoal to find the path that I want. And then I'm going to do some kind of negative drawing, use my paper towel to kind of cut that out a little bit. So again, I hope you're taking some time to draw, especially during these times. This is an activity that I find really helpful in terms of bringing me into the present moment. This forces me to focus on this object, and as I do that, I get kind of sucked into it more and more. And when the drawing's done, I can enter back into the real world. But for now, I'm going to let myself kind of become immersed in the world of this cup. So aside from everybody here watching, and the fact that I've got this, got these cameras rolling here, my focus is on the drawing. I'm not thinking about what else is happening in the world right now, and I think that's helpful. And again, I kind of caught myself there using marks that were not helpful to establishing the direction of that shadow plane. there's a little bit of light down in here. That's something I missed earlier. So right in here, there's some kind of nuance in the shadow. There's light bouncing off the surface up into the underside of that cup and then back into that shadow area on that plane. And I didn't see that earlier. All right. And one of the things that's really kind of fascinating is right in this area here, I think I've overstated that edge. If you look at that reference photo, there's a lost and found edge where we can see the edge of the cup clearly along in here, but right in this area it just kind of disappears. Those values are very similar. So I want my drawing to reflect that. Let that edge in the drawing just kind of disappear. Let me see, I'm going to move back to this part of the handle here. Start to look at some of those value relationships. And what I'm thinking about here is that surface plane. I'm working on the top edge of the handle. And then it turns a corner into a horizontal edge. And I'm working on that top dimension there. Maybe erase this out a little bit. And the whole inside of this handle kind of falls into shadow. As now you can see it gets dark and along this edge here. What I'm going to do is actually soften that edge. And then I'm going to come back in with my compressed charcoal. And I'm going to run my marks vertically here. Again, to kind of reinforce the vertical nature of that edge as the handle kind of turns from the top plane to that side plane. Run those vertically here and then down into here. So this is the shape that represents the edge of that handle. All right, so I'm going to continue to work on this area here. This all just falls into shadow here. So now I can run the inside plane of that handle, can run these marks along on a different plane. I'm looking at a different kind of set of cross contour marks. And then I'm going to use the side of that handle as a different direction of the marks. And that will help to reinforce that form there. I'm feeling pretty good about that. And there's some kind of nuance in the handle here that I can come back to. There's light bouncing around inside, off the cup and into the inside edge of that handle that I can start to create and start to represent in the drawing. But I'm going to leave that for now. I want the overall value to be effective. Now you can see there's kind of a light edge along here that transitions down into this side, and that becomes another lost edge where it becomes really difficult to see where the edge of that handle ends and where that background begins. It's not a really clearly defined edge, and I want my drawing to reflect that as well. All right. So now I feel like I could start to bring up some of the other areas here. I'm feeling good in there about that. Now I want to place the base of the cup. Now you can see it like this area right now is all just shadow form. Watch what happens when I just bring in the slightest amount of detail here. So this represents that bottom edge of the cup, the base of the cup. That little shadow that gets captured under there. All of a sudden, that form sits in that shadow. So it takes very little to actually, to actually define an object. So now as I start to define that bottom edge of the cup, I'm getting into that area that I was talking about earlier with the bounce light, that reflected light right in here where it gets a little bit lighter. And before I go for my eraser, what I want to actually do is I want to test darkening the area leading up to it. I want to look at these value relationships. There's the value here and the value here, and what I'm observing is that they're pretty similar. This feels a little bit darker to me, but I feel like I can still come down in value here. So I'm going to darken this a bit. And then just in the nature of that contrast, you can see that light starting to form in here. And then if anything, what I can do is I can actually start to darken the base of the cup a little bit more to define that edge. Because what I really want to avoid is I want to avoid overstating this bounce light. And if I go to the eraser too early, before I've exhausted my control over values in the areas around it, I run the risk of making that bounce light feel too strong, and that will actually flatten out the object. We don't want to do that. I'll let this kind of blend in here. Doing some negative drawing right in this area here. I want that to feel like shadow. Our eyes are really sensitive to value relationships, so it takes very little to actually to perceive a subtle value shift. And you want to use that to your advantage as an artist, as you're working in the charcoal. Don't be afraid to go subtle. If anything, our instinct is going to be to overstate something. We don't need to do that. Be subtle with it. And then use kind of high contrast sparingly. Somebody posted a question here. So the inside of the cup is lighter than the background to me. Are you doing this intentionally? So, I see what you're saying. Like right in here, on the reference photo, this actually is darker. That's a really good observation that you made there. And so what that means is that I can either lighten this area up so that it's lighter than that background, or I can darken this a little bit more. And then because I have this situation where I have light to dark transition, so this becomes dark against the light, and this becomes light against something that's a little bit darker. I can kind of play with that a little bit. I can artificially darken this side of the drawing. And maybe that's what it is. Maybe I just erased too much of the background, but that was a really good observation there. Thank you for pointing that out. That was awesome. That's a very kind of subtle, and that's exactly what I'm looking for here. There's some areas actually where that value looks almost identical. We can kind of see that transition back in here as we go from dark to light. And there's areas where those values on either side align with one another. And so, all right, let me bring this up in value a little bit, kind of pull that up with my kneaded eraser. And I'm going to look to see if there's any kind of value information that allows me to reinforce that form. I'm worried about this becoming too kind of flat. So again, going right over the edge of the cup, so I'm not creating a halo. And then I can reinforce that edge. And then right around in here, I'm going to anchor my hand Now there's a bit of a difference between, I think, that reference photo and what I'm looking at. It's kind of changing a little bit. So I want to be really sensitive in that area. Maybe what I'll do is I'll lighten this up a little bit more even. And bring this down in value. So I've just got some charcoal that's just sitting on the side of my hand here. I'm going to use that to tone the paper a little bit. And then I still see what you mentioned earlier. So let me, it's very, very subtle. Part of that, there's also a temperature shift in the reference photo from kind of being a little bit cooler in the cup, a little bit warmer. Warmer in the background. Actually, I like that. There's a bit of an angle to that reflected light. Maybe what I'll do is I'll kind of sharpen or erase this out here to redefine that edge. What do we think there? I feel like that's a bit better, perhaps a bit more accurate. That's that subtlety that I was going for in choosing this subject. All right, so now what I want to do is I want to kind of attack that edge there, kind of lightening it up, and then I'm going to bring back in another value in here. Kind of smoothing out a little bit. Actually, there's a bunch of shadows in here. You can see there's this kind of sliver of a thin kind of shadow, cast shadow here. And one of the advantages to building up a layer of vine charcoal first is that it allows this layer of compressed charcoal to kind of float a little bit more. It doesn't get too kind of locked onto the page. Kind of part of that seasoning that I referred to earlier. You know, as the layers of charcoal build up, that surface just becomes richer, and it becomes a little bit more forgiving. And if you're kind of experimenting with various drawing papers, pay attention to how the paper releases the charcoal. You know, how easily can you erase it? You know, we often spend so much time thinking about the pencils, the charcoal that we use, all of which is helpful and important. Like, you know, having good materials can really be helpful. It should never inhibit you from drawing. I would hate for anybody to say, well, I can't draw right now because I don't have the right materials. I mean, you can just pick up a regular, you know, #2 pencil and start drawing, or grab a piece of office paper and start drawing. But at the same time, you start to appreciate the materials as you work. And one of the things that we often kind of underestimate is the value of really good paper, and using the right paper. So there I came back in with some of that reflected light, overstated a little bit, and I can kind of wash over it with the charcoal again to knock that down. But getting back to the paper, you know, find something that works for you, because you know, they each kind of perform differently. Some papers will really grab the charcoal and not let go. When you try to erase it back out, it just won't do it. And I've seen so many students get really frustrated, and they put it on themselves. They think they're the ones that are not drawing properly, when in fact they're really just working with the paper. And it's not necessarily a matter of good paper versus bad paper, but just the right paper. So the right paper in one circumstance may not be the right in another. So if I was working with graphite at this point, and I might choose a different paper. This is just kind of regular drawing paper. I think it's working out really well. Sometimes I'll draw with a cotton rag paper. That's kind of meant more for printmaking or something, and I really like the way that works. So I might give that a shot. But you know, again, for beginners, we often kind of neglect to really consider the paper that you're working on, and so I'd encourage you to experiment. Right here, I'm going to sharpen this up. I'm actually getting pretty close to the end here. And then I'm going to bring in some highlights. Now this shadow here you can kind of see is softer than the others. It's more diffused along the edges. Maybe what I'll do is I'll try to erase, do some negative drawing in here to erase out that shadow. This perhaps could be sharper along in here. I don't know if I got that proportion just right, but it's close enough. All right, so just kind of adjusting, tweaking the value relationships that I'm seeing. Let me see, how am I feeling about this edge? This is going to be a strong focal point, so I just want to sharpen this up a little bit. This is a point where I can start to bring in the chalk pencil, this white chalk, and reestablish some of those highlights here. So I can kind of pull out a highlight back along this edge. And it starts to pop that out a little bit. Not a super clean edge here, but that's all right. I think in that reference that kind of lost and found quality that I mentioned earlier, bringing that forward. Pull out this highlight here. And there are some subtle reflections in kind of highlights in the bowl, and I can use those to kind of establish that form back in there. And when I'm doing that, I'm thinking about that plane, being careful to really understand the curve of the bowl here. So I don't want that to feel like a flat shape. I'm letting these highlights kind of wrap around there. There's one over here. All right. So I think that'll do it for today. This is my cup, white on white subject, really looking at edges. Now, one of the things that you're going to notice and what I want to do in the next drawing, so every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I'm going to be here working live, working on another drawing to help me build up my skills. The next one I want to work on is with regards to contour edges and really refining my contour lines. Now, if you see here, I've used very few lines to define the edge of the cup here. Instead, it's all about value relationships. It's how dark this is compared to that background, and that edge is defined where those values separate, right? Even in these thin areas here, I'm not thinking about it as much as a line as much as just an edge between dark, a thin edge of light, and then a dark edge behind it. So when I move into the next drawing, if you join me on Wednesdays, we'll be focusing more on contour lines and really kind of building up skills to enhance your drawing through line variation, and that can be a really helpful tool for any kind of sketching, for kind of more refined drawings, etc. Now, so here at Artist Network, if you're looking for things to do, if you're stuck at home and you're looking for ways to build your skills, check out Artist Network TV. Hundreds of videos that you can be watching. We've got deals going on now, so I'd encourage you to kind of explore those options and see what's right for you. Join me again on Wednesday at the same time. We're going to do another drawing, and I look forward to seeing you. So come on back.